My name is Jonathan Solomon. I'm an architect, and I am an educator. I'm between positions. I'm leaving a position at Syracuse University, where I've been associate dean for 2 years, and I'm on my way to become director of architecture, interior architecture, and design objects at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. We talked last night about Batman Begins, which I found fascinating because, of course, the prequel as a narrative form always follows the story. The past always follows the present. There was no Batman Begins before there was Batman. No one would have been interested in it, and it might not have existed. And so my speculation last night was that origin stories are actually written in the present and in the future and not in the past. So I'm moving to Chicago in August, and suddenly I have an origin story in Chicago by virtue of making that move. But before that happened, I had origin stories that were located elsewhere. So I can't help but turn this back around on you, speculate. This whole project is part of an effort on your part to use the present to write the origins of your colleagues, your friends, your mentors, your maybe your competitors, and your compatriots. But I was born in Chicago. I lived there for 18 years. I left. I lived outside of Chicago for 18 years, to the month, August 1996. And so I feel that the opportunity to return there is an opportunity for me to reconsider the input that those 18 years might have had on my origins and on my future, and I'm looking forward to it. You know, I wasn't trained as an architect, really. I had an undergraduate degree in urban studies from Columbia University. I had always wanted to be an architect, and everyone had advised me against it. And going off to Columbia was a kind of a compromise with my own desires and the advice that I took from people in my life who I trusted. He suggested that I start off broad. I went from Columbia to Princeton University to get a Master of Architecture degree, where everyone knows you don't actually get educated in architecture and how it operates. I then went on and I did 2 years of work for Jesse Reiser and Anna Gugumoto in an office where I learned a tremendous amount, but in a very, let's say, highly specialized way about what architecture is and what architecture practice is. And throughout all of that, I think the thread that kept me interested in what I was doing was well, it's what's brilliantly on display in Venice. It's the kind of matrix of personalities and personal stories, the matrix of ideas, sort of germinating ideas that begin small and in inconspicuous places and then grow and take hold and gain followers and ultimately have impacts, have relevant impacts, not just on the world of architecture, but on the world at large. And while I had opportunities to be involved in building making and space making, my opportunities to be involved in idea making, idea finding, idea shepherding, and idea supporting were ultimately much more rewarding. 306090 was certainly an exercise in that. That was an exercise in looking out at the world, finding people who had ideas, collecting them, and handing them around to people and seeing what happened with them. That project began in 2001. That's over a decade ago, and now those people whose ideas we were passing around in a more or less amateur fashion are now heading firms and running schools and building things and educating people and making architecture and making space and making ideas of their own in much more sophisticated ways. It's been a kind of a thrill to see some of them here in Venice actually doing that work. I think cities as territories for the germination of ideas are incredibly rich. Cities force people and activities and things that don't necessarily go along with one another into close proximity. Sometimes they force them to overlap, and then they force solutions, and those solutions sometimes create spaces, products, surfaces that we didn't even know we needed, that then become ubiquitous. In 2003, I completed a master's thesis at Princeton on a highway in the Bronx called the Sheridan Expressway, which certain constituencies wanted to widen and expand so it could take on more traffic, and other constituencies wanted to remove and replace with a park. And the thesis proposal was to do both at the same time, kind of use that quality of cities that force sometimes mutually exclusive things to share the same space and look for solutions there. And that work, which took on a kind of it had a character that was of Princeton in 2003, but which ultimately led to the pamphlet architecture book in 2004, 13 projects for the Sheridan Expressway. It was nearly a decade later. It was 2012 when Cities Without Ground finally appeared. But that same desire, which was to look at the way in which cities use complex arrangements of space to allow for multiple different cultures to thrive simultaneously, really led to both works. In many ways, Cities Without Ground was the book that I hoped the pamphlet architecture would be, but couldn't quite do at the time. I didn't quite know that I would want to do at the time. I spent some preliminary time before my thesis began looking at the Park Avenue Tunnel in New York, which is where Park Avenue goes underground briefly to 34th and then comes up and moves through Grand Central Station, and that kind of complex three-dimensional knot of automobile, pedestrian, and rail movement. And didn't really know what that meant or what it could be until getting to Hong Kong and seeing it played out at an urban scale. That project, of course, led to, talk about origins, that project led to exciting opportunities in areas that I didn't expect I would be moving in. So I presented that work to a convention of shopping mall operators. I presented that work in the Asian Studies Department at NYU. I've presented that work to the professional community in architecture that's actually making those buildings in Hong Kong and elsewhere in Asia. And that's been a thrill and an unexpected one. It's funny that you bring up analysis, right? As one of the last members of my family not to be in analysis. Perhaps you're onto something here. You know, I hadn't thought of it that way. Certainly, you know, the work has taken me in directions that I have always thought of as being a result of a mistrust of the visible and a mistrust of the fashionable. I've seen fashion move at great speeds in architecture and embrace and abandon valuable ideas. And I don't think it's a positive force. I think it's actually a destructive force in the discipline, and I think it has a lot to do with how things look. In the same way that a lot of the kind of outdated hierarchies that we cling to in urbanism have a lot more to do with how buildings and spaces look than what they are and how they work. So I mistrust it. I mistrust what I see on the face of a building, and my inclination is to discard it and reject it and to look for what's under it. And I similarly mistrust what I see on the cover of a magazine, unless it's a good friend. I mistrust what I see on the cover of a magazine because I suspect that within a short period of time it won't be there anymore. And I try to encourage I would try to encourage you to look beyond the cover of Architect magazine, you know, at what's deeply valuable and relevant about the work and what you can do with it, and concentrate less perhaps on what it looks like.